How did a small island nation come to rule a quarter of the world? This is the story of the British Empire, an epic of ambition, conquest, and profound change that shaped the world we live in today. Let's rewind the clock and explore its entire history. Our story begins in the 16th century, during the Age of Exploration. While Spain and Portugal were carving up the New World, England was a latecomer to the party. But what it lacked in timing, it made up for in sheer determination. English privateers, essentially state-sanctioned pirates like the legendary Sir Francis Drake, began chipping away at Spanish dominance on the high seas, plundering treasure fleets and paving the way for England's own imperial ambitions. The real groundwork was laid in the early 1600s. In 1607, a group of hardy settlers established Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America. This was a precarious beginning, fraught with hardship, but it was a foothold that would eventually grow into 30 thriving colonies. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a group of merchants formed the East India Company in 1600. This seemingly humble trading company would become an unstoppable force, eventually ruling over the entire Indian subcontinent. During this first empire, the focus was largely on the Americas. The Caribbean islands, like Barbados and Jamaica, became immensely profitable through sugar plantations. But this wealth was built on a brutal foundation: the transatlantic slave trade. Britain became a dominant player in this horrific system, forcibly transporting millions of Africans across the ocean in inhumane conditions to toil in the colonies. This is a dark and undeniable part of the empire's origins. Back in North America, life in the colonies flourished, but it was far from peaceful. Conflicts with indigenous peoples were constant as settlers pushed further inland, and fierce rivalries with other European powers, particularly France, defined the era. This rivalry culminated in the 7 Years' War, a truly global conflict. Britain's victory in 1763 was staggering. It seized Canada from the French and secured key territories, establishing itself as the world's foremost colonial power. But pride comes before a fall. Just over a decade later, in 1776, the American Revolution erupted. The loss of the 13 colonies was a humiliating blow, marking the end of the First British Empire and a major turning point in its history. So, what do you do when you lose your most valuable colonies? If you're Britain, you build a second, even bigger empire. Stung by the loss of America, Britain turned its gaze eastward to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. This was the dawn of the Pax Britannica, a century of relative peace, where Britain's industrial might and unrivaled navy allowed it to dominate global trade and politics. The absolute centerpiece of this new empire was India. After the pivotal Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company's influence grew exponentially. But after the massive Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British government decided to take direct control, dissolving the company and establishing the British Raj. India became known as the jewel in the crown, a vast source of wealth, resources, and manpower for the empire. Simultaneously, Britain was planting its flag across the globe. Australia began as a penal colony. New Zealand was colonized through a controversial treaty with the Maori people, and strategic ports like Singapore and Hong Kong became vital hubs in a global network of trade. The 19th century also saw a major moral shift: the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. Followed by the emancipation of all enslaved people in the empire in 1833, was a landmark moment. Of course, this didn't end exploitation, but it did shift the empire's economic focus more towards industrial goods and resources. This industrial power fueled the next great phase of expansion: the scramble for Africa. In the late 19th century, European powers raced to carve up the African continent, and Britain was at the forefront. It claimed vast territories from Cairo to Cape Town, including Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire was at its zenith. It was the largest empire in human history, covering a quarter of the world's land area and ruling over nearly a quarter of its population. The sun, it was famously said, never set on the British Empire. But empires, no matter how vast, are not eternal. The 20th century would bring to world wars that would shatter the old order and spell the beginning of the end for British imperial rule. In World War I, The empire mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Millions of soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and the Caribbean fought and died for Britain. The war effort was immense, and in its aftermath, the empire actually reached its greatest territorial extent, gaining former German and Ottoman territories. But the war drained Britain's treasury and manpower. More importantly, it ignited nationalist movements across the colonies. The promises of self-determination made during the war were not forgotten. This momentum for independence grew stronger, and then came World War II. Once again, the empire was crucial to the Allied victory. But by the war's end in the age of decolonization had arrived. The process began swiftly. In 1947, the jewel in the crown, India, gained its independence, though it was tragically partitioned into India and Pakistan, leading to immense violence and displacement. This event sent a shockwave across the empire. One by one, other colonies followed suit. The wind of change, as Prime Minister Harold Macmillan called it, swept through Africa in the 1950s and 60s, with nations like Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya achieving independence. The process continued for decades, with the final, symbolic end often cited as the handover of Hong Kong back to China in 1997. The empire was officially over. So what is left of this colossal enterprise? The legacy of the British Empire is everywhere, and it's incredibly complex. The English language is a global lingua franca. Legal and governmental systems in many countries, from parliamentary democracy to common law, are based on British models. Sports like cricket and football are played passionately from the Caribbean to South Asia. And then there's the Commonwealth of Nations. This is a voluntary association of 56 independent states, most of which are former British colonies. It's not an empire, but a unique network that fosters cooperation on trade, education, and democratic values. A modern echo of a shared and often difficult past. The story of the British Empire is a story of contradictions. It connected the globe through trade and technology, but it did so through conquest and coercion. It spread ideas of law and liberty, while simultaneously denying those same rights to millions. Its history is a mixture of innovation and exploitation, progress and oppression. Understanding this vast and complicated history is essential to understanding the world we all share today. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. We'll see you next time.